Okay, good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Anticipatory Grief. We appreciate all of you being here. And as a reminder, these complimentary monthly webinars are brought to you through a wonderful collaboration between O'Connor Mortuary, Care Choice Hospice and Palliative Services in Alzheimer's Orange County. And this is Kim from Alzheimer's Orange County, and I'll be your host today. The sponsors that you see on your screen that I just mentioned provide these webinars as a service to the aging community. So the topics that are chosen are beneficial for anyone who cares for and works with older adults. And we also welcome family members who are caring for an older adult. So we hope that you find the topics and sessions informative and useful. Okay, Dr. William Hoy is a clinical professor at Baylor University, where he's taught since 2012, following more than 25 years of clinical experience in palliative care. Having directed pastoral care and bereavement programs at 2 hospices, and also serving as a pastor. Dr. Hoy is passionate about making sure the dying and bereaved are treated with compassion and understanding, and is widely regarded as an authority on this subject. He holds undergraduate degrees in the social sciences and graduate training in practical theology and counseling. His books include Do Funerals Matter? The Purposes and Practices of Death Rituals in Global Perspective, and Bereavement Groups and the Role of Social Support, Integrating Theory, Research, and Practice, as well as The Road to, and Dr. Hoy, I'm probably going to mispronounce this, is that Emmaus? Emmaus, thank you. He has also authored more than 100 book chapters, educational pamphlets, and journal articles over the more than 3 decades that he has been working in this field. So we're just absolutely thrilled that we have access to you, Dr. Hoy, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you to all of you who are joining us today. I am speaking to you from my home office in Central Texas, where it was a balmy 26 this morning. So I bet Southern Californians are enjoying a bit toastier weather than we are here. And so thinking about the grief that comes about before the death of somebody I care about. That's the term that we typically, or the way we typically define anticipatory grief. I have a couple of things I'd like to do in the time we spend together today. First of all, I would like to overview a little bit about what we are thinking in the among the community of clinical scholars working in the interface of end of life and bereavement, what we are thinking these days about how grief really works, how it doesn't work. Moreover, I'd like to spend some time talking with you about 4 sort of key principles, I suppose one would call them, for interfacing, interacting with, and providing intervention with patients and their families as death approaches. So all of us most likely had an encounter in our undergrad training, if not earlier, with the work of Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, her 5 stages of the dying process: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, enjoy certainly a great deal of social understanding. It's kind of the ubiquitous brand when it comes to grief processes. It's important for you to know, as a clinician or a volunteer working at the interface with people in anticipatory grief, that the model that Dr. Kübler-Ross articulated in 1969, while it certainly seemed state of the art at the time, her stages seemed like a very logical way to approach the dying process. It is important for you to understand that this is a model that has enjoyed neither widespread appropriation among clinical scholars specializing in bereavement, nor have we ever been able to find any empirical evidence to support the theory. In fact, grief works much more in a fluid process than in a linear one. The whole notion of loss being integrated into life in some kind of a stepwise or linear fashion is simply one that does not ring true with grieving people. And so we don't use this model at all in talking about the grieving process. Rather, instead of talking about grief in some kind of step-by-step or stage version, we think about the experiences that are required to be faced in bereavement, knowing that different individuals experience them at different times and in different ways that are dependent on many different things. One way to think about this is that just as every relationship is unique, no two marriages, no two parent-child relationships, no two sibling or friend relationships, no two relationships are alike, so too neither two bereavements are alike, because bereavement is fundamentally determined by the relationship that we had with the individual who has died. Now, one way that I think about the grief process, and it is only a way, it is not the way, but a way to think about the grief process is one that takes into account that we have a number of different, call them tasks or needs to address in the grief process. And certainly people that have heard me speak before, have been present in workshops, have attended classes where I've been involved or have read my work, have encountered the compass model that I think about. And essentially, it works this way. My thinking is that in the grief process, we are all trying to find our way in uncharted territory, in a place that we've never been before, even if we've had multiple losses. And on the road to doing that, we do these very organic, natural, in fact, I suggest they are as natural as breathing. These things that help us to what I call integrate the loss. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. So one of those things, and you'll notice that I try to avoid saying first and second and third and fourth, because I don't want to imply that one of these things either needs to be done ahead of the others, nor that one is somehow preeminent or more important. One of the things we think of immediately when supporting bereaved individuals, whether before or after a death, is the power of story. How do stories get told? How are they shared? How are they transmitted from one family member to another, from one member of the community to another? And stories are incredibly important. However, stories also speak to us in terms of the values that we have shared. So this photo, as you can tell by the date on it, is quite old now. Our daughter is grown, married, and on her own. But her horse, Chief, who moved with us from Southern California when we came to Texas quite a number of years ago now, Chief was a member of our family, and an incredible member of our family. In the aftermath of his death, when Carolyn was a freshman in college, Debbie and I talked about, in many ways, Chief imparted character to our daughter in ways that we never could. He taught her responsibility. He taught her friendship. He taught her things that even her husband today says he is grateful for Chief and her life, because Chief helped to make Carolyn into the woman she is. I think that that's a really important way for us to think about remembering. Obviously, most of us have not had a horse die in the family, but most of us have had somebody we love and care about. And what I encourage folks to do is to tell stories, and then I respond to that by saying, well, it sounds like your dad is a man of great generosity, or wow, it sounds like your mom is a person with lots of compassion. And I think what we're doing there, whether talking in present tense or past tense, we are we are helping to allow the story to become the means whereby the value statements, the character qualities are transmitted from generation to generation. Now, there is another thing that I think we do very intuitively, very organically. We tell stories without anybody having to tell us to do so, but we also find the meanings, the anchors that support us in the loss. In many ways, the grief process, in the words of my colleague and friend at University of Memphis, Bob Niemeyer, is the grief process really is a search for meaning. It's figuring out, who am I now in the light of this loss? Who will I be into the future? How has my life been changed by this? And all of that grows out of this meaning structure. Because I think that is so fundamental to anticipatory grief, we're going to talk in more detail about that in just a few moments. But for the moment, you'll notice on my slide, these are all religious symbols, but by no means do these meanings have to be religious. It is interesting that in our society, and this would be as true in Southern California as it is anywhere else, most of us derive much of our afterlife or death-related meaning from some religious connotation, even if we don't have a preference for a particular religious community or a particular belief system. They still grow out of some kind of, most often, religious sort of underpinning that then may have been personalized in a lot of different ways. But whether an individual does or not, this reaffirming may be simply, I'm reaffirming the value of life, that life is intrinsically valuable and that life is to be cherished, or it is to be preserved, or whatever the case may be. A third piece in the bereavement process, both before and after the death, is what I call realizing or coming to terms with the reality of the death and the magnitude of the pain of grief. I show this particular picture from one of the innumerable trips that I've made. A group of us at Baylor and in Waco work with a local nonprofit that runs a clinic in a very, very destitute part of extraordinarily rural western Kenya. And in that part of Kenya, there is a coffin shop or two in every village market. Death is very much a part of the culture. It's known. The life expectancy on the plateau where we work is 43 years of age. So a good almost 35 years less than it is in most of the U.S. Of all the mothers that I know on the Nyackach Plateau, I've not ever known of a mother who had not had at least one child die, and most have had several children die. And about 1/3 of children die before the age of 5 in that particular area. So very, very remote, very destitute, very poor health. Death is not ignored. It is not, there is no cover up. I can only imagine if I were to set up a coffin shop outside of the Laguna Hills Mall or something like that, what a stir it would cause in the community. But when death is all about you, it isn't nearly that big of a deal. The reason that I leave this notion of realizing a bit later in the process is because I think our default position is to think that the confrontation between denial and reality is something that we deal with initially. I deal with it when I first learn there's a diagnosis, or I deal with it when I find out my loved one has just died, and then that is fairly well and fairly quickly dispensed with, when in fact what we find is it's not typically dispensed with quickly at all. Those of us who work a lot with bereaved people after a death know that they frequently will acknowledge months down the road, I was sitting in the living room. I heard a sound outside, jumped up thinking that he'd returned home. Halfway to the door, I realized, no, it couldn't be because he's died. And again, I'm confronted with that reality. This is not once and done. This is done over a period of time. And in some ways, we continue confronting the reality of the death for the rest of our lives in some ways. My dad's it's been 25 years that he died. And every now and then I'm reminded again of his death and its reality. Probably most recently when my mom died 2 years ago, and I was again confronted with the fact that Dad was not here. So I think this is an ongoing process, as are all of these. We keep telling stories throughout the grief process. We keep finding meanings throughout the grief process. We keep coming to terms with the reality throughout the grief process. And then fourthly, I think, or in addition, I think we also must do some releasing. We must find the ways to say goodbye to the relationship as we knew it and move into a future that does not include the deceased. I love this particular photo that comes from Ohio. You might recognize the Ohio State cheer being given by the deceased, who is the I, and his 3 adult children, who are respectively the O, the H, and the O. At Ohio State football games, the fans jump to their feet on a touchdown or a first down, and they do the Ohio State cheer, O-H-I-O. Apparently, Mr. Miracle, David Miracle, I believe was his name, loved being the I, and so his kids decided they would make him the I one last time as his kids and the rest of the mourners in the funeral chapel said goodbye to him. My point is simply this, that all throughout history and all around the world today, we are engaged in the process of saying goodbye. It is rarely a once and done, one-off kind of experience. We say goodbye to the deceased as we say farewell, perhaps at the home when the death occurs. When a couple of daughters join with the hospice nurse in bathing their mom the last time before the funeral directors arrive, they are saying goodbye. They say goodbye perhaps again at the mortuary or the crematory or at the cemetery. They say goodbye at the funeral or the memorial service. They say goodbye at the first set of holidays that comes around and the Thanksgiving table is empty and dad or mom or brother, sister or husband or wife or child's place is empty. They say goodbye again as Mother's Day or Father's Day or other special family occasions come around. And 10 years from now, when Grandpa's not present, when the oldest granddaughter gets married, we say goodbye again. And so my point is, in all of these ways, these are not stages we walk through. These are experiences all of us have commonly as we find our own personal way through grief. The whole goal of grief, in my estimation, is not to get over it. We are not talking about recovery. We are not talking about moving on. We are not talking about putting this behind us and finding a new place. Rather, we are talking about integrating this loss into the rest of our lives. We don't get over losses. We meld them into who we are. These losses and the people whose lives they represent become a permanent part of who we are. And we are marked by that relationship from now on. So we don't get over the loss as much as we integrate the loss. That does not mean that in normal grief we continue to mourn 5 years from now like we do today. I can speak of my father. I can speak of children who've died. I can speak of friends. I can speak of them typically without great sadness. Nevertheless, their deaths mark who we are, and they change who we become. Grief is literally a bridge from the me who used to be to the me who is going to be. And that is a constant state of transformation. It's a state of transformation, though, that I believe begins for families and even for the person who is dying herself or himself during the dying process. And one of the ways I think we come to terms with that is by thinking about what are this multitude of losses that we have as we face our own dying. If I were in the room with all of you today together, we'd just share ideas. But because we're not doing that, I'll just offer some things folks have taught me over the years about what we lose in dying. We often lose our sense of independence, our sense of being able to go and come and do what we want. We may lose our sense of mobility, and I'm no longer able to get around. My wife, who is looking after a friend of ours who lives some distance away and is dying from end-stage, widely metastatic pancreatic cancer, took her shopping last week when Debbie was there, and they planned 2 or 3 stops. And at the end of the first, her friend said, "You know, I think it's time for us to go home." And where just 6 months ago, they would have been able to shop all day and have enjoyed being with each other and gone to lunch and started early and finished late. She is no longer able to do that. And that loss is acute. That's what I mean. In dying, we lose so many things. We also face in our dying, we face the fear and the very real proximity, not just of our death and what's behind it, but the place between here and death. And so we'll talk more about fears. Essentially, one way to think about this is that in the dying process, there are some core, I call them processes, that take place. We come to terms with our beliefs. We come to terms with the fears and find a way through them. We think about the things we want to get finished. I call those tasks, as do many of my colleagues. And then we also are confronted by the core process of legacy. What is my life counted for? What are the things I hope that I'm leaving behind in the wake of my life? So let me talk about each of those 4. So our personal beliefs and practices that we evaluate. I think there's several things that you and I as clinicians or volunteers do as we help dying persons and their families think about this whole notion of belief. One of those has to do with the only term I've been able to come up with, and it's very much for me still a term in flux, but it's the term I'm using of belief durability. Here's what I mean by that. So all of us come at life out of a worldview that says there are things we have come to know and expect about the way life works. So we assume that if we drive safely, we will remain safe in our car. We make the assumption that when we go to bed tonight, we will wake up tomorrow. And so most of us think as we retire tonight about the tasks that we have in front of us tomorrow, with really very little awareness that many people die during the night, including a whole lot of people who were perfectly healthy. So there's something else for you to worry about today. Now, belief durability means that when I learn of a terminal diagnosis or when I learn of a serious illness of somebody I love, all of the things that I have held as secure beliefs such as parents do not die after children. Children remain alive to bury their parents. So when a child is diagnosed with a life-limiting, a life-threatening illness or injury, it calls that belief into question. The belief that I'm going to live into an age group similar to what my parents and grandparents did. So if my mother lived to be 91, and I'm diagnosed with an incurable tumor when I'm 62, I wonder what happened to that other 30 years and all the things I'd planned, perhaps many of the things that I put off until I retired have now loomed large as a loss. So my belief has become somewhat in flux. And my perspective, as well as that of most of us who are thinking, writing, practicing in this arena, realize that one of the things that happens for most people in the dying process is they have to hold their beliefs up in the cold light of day and ask myself, does this belief sustain me now? If I find that it does, then no harm, no foul. If I find that that belief in some way it leaves me lacking, then I have some things I need to do with it. I need to renegotiate that belief to make it one that I can actually sort of assimilate into this illness, or that this illness assimilates with. One of the ways we do that is when we make sense of it. So perhaps a way to make sense of an illness is to say something like, well, okay, it makes some sense that I would have serious heart disease at age 62 because my grandfather died from end-stage heart disease. My father and mother both died young from heart disease. My two brothers died young from heart disease. So in some ways, it makes sense. That doesn't mean it's palatable. It just means I'm able to find some explanation for it that works at least to some level of satisfaction. Maybe more commonly, we tend to find benefit in things, the silver cloud, as it were, in every, or the silver lining in every dark cloud. So because I am diagnosed with a serious illness, maybe I keep short accounts, and so I work more. I work harder to build relationships or to restore relationships. So there's some benefit. It's not particularly directly related to the illness in this case, but I'm finding some good thing in spite of, as it were. And then a third area has to do with identity change. So I become a different person. People in Southern California, at least, who know me and have followed my work know a couple of years ago, not quite 2 years ago, I was involved in a pretty horrific car crash, sustained a head injury and permanent brain damage as a result of that, which has made it more common for me to have word finding issues, and certainly people who have heard me present before hear that more frequently today than they once did. It takes me much longer to write things and to actually get things done than it once did. I have a hard time staying focused, staying on track if I don't have things written down. In fact, if I don't write them down, I very likely forget to do them. And all of those are new changes, and they drive people crazy. They drive me crazy as one who never had to do that, had a near photographic memory and all of those kinds of things. I could quote studies off the top of my head and those kinds of things. Well, one of the things, though, that I realize is that in the aftermath of that experience, I have learned to be more compassionate. I've particularly become more understanding of and compassionate to people that have some kind of intellectual disability. I understand dementia in a very personal way because I deal with so many of the same symptoms and am treated with the same medications to help keep these issues at bay. And so I appreciate those things. My identity has been transformed in some way by the loss that I encountered, to say nothing of the fact that both of my passengers, one died instantly, the other died just a few months ago, as a result of injury sustained in that crash. I was the only survivor in my car long term. And so negotiating those beliefs and the kinds of things, I'd always thought to be a defensive driver. In fact, that day on the freeway, I purposefully saw traffic in front of me stopping, and I applied the brakes early enough to leave extra space between the car in front of me and mine. Unfortunately, the texting truck driver behind me did not, and hit us in a 47,000-pound commercial truck going 69 miles an hour. Okay, so my point to this is that what we have to do is we have to hold up our beliefs and say, all right, this is what I believe to be true. Is this durable in light of this particular crisis? And then the third piece to this is what I call revising connections to the community of belief. So for many people, that's going to be a faith community of some sort, though certainly not all. And as those of you who work with the dying know, sometimes as death approaches, we want reintegration with the faith of our fathers. Sometimes we want nothing to do with the faith that perhaps we grew up with, but we're looking for some connection of a community who shares our values, belief system, and some of those kinds of things. And I find that that's the place where hospital and hospice chaplains are incredibly useful because they are often good bridge builders for folks to kind of hear what patients and their families are saying and what they feel like they are needing in all of this. So some questions that I like to ask patients as we're sort of working through all of this together. I like to just flat out ask people, what spiritual or philosophical beliefs help you cope with difficulty? Here, what I have in mind is sort of the general coping skill. What is it about your belief system that helps you get through this? I ask people fairly plainly, where has God been for you lately? I will especially ask this after I ask this first question and people say, oh, well, my religious belief or my faith belief, or, God is, I've come to believe God doesn't give you any more than you can bear, or whatever it may be. Then I'll sometimes ask this question. So where has God been for you lately? Close at hand, far off, somewhere in between? As a clergy person, though I don't practice in that arena anymore, I discovered that it was pretty important for me to offer a latitude, a wide range of possible answers to people, because I think folks otherwise might think the clergy expect them to talk about how their faith is intact and God is. And what I've learned in my experience personally and with patients is sometimes the divine feels pretty far off. And then how do you find yourself managing doubts and misgivings? What are you doing? How are you coping with that? What works? What doesn't work? Any of those kinds of questions, which you'll notice all start with what's and where's and when's and how's and who's, invite people to tell their story and invite us as care providers into those stories. Well, how about fear? I'll let you look at that photo for just a moment, assuming that you can see it well. I make it to the fence in 2.8 seconds. Can you? One of the things that I've learned over my life is that fear is greatly underrated. We think that it really, it's something to be pushed aside, done away with, turned away. And what I've found instead is that fear actually has an extraordinarily important adaptive role for us, because it does often keep us safe. I'll be quite honest with you. I drive much more aware of commercial trucks around me than I did before that wreck in February of 2017. And I imagine I always will. That's what fear can do for us. And it is an element of post-traumatic stress disorder for which I had been treated, but I'll guarantee you that's a piece of that experience that doesn't go away, and probably I don't want it to. I do want to remain alert. I suspect the reason, or at least a reason, that many of us don't drive 90 miles an hour down a city street is because we're afraid that we'll hit a child or another pedestrian and cause injury or death to someone. Or perhaps we're afraid we're going to get a ticket that we can't afford to pay. Or maybe we're afraid we're going to be in a wreck and hurt ourselves, or any number of different things. But again, it's primarily not Usually it's not, oh yeah, I'm just such a law-abiding citizen and I know it's the best thing to do. It usually, what causes us to make many decisions is our fear. And what I find is patients are not all that different from that when they come to fears as well. So how do we go about helping patients with these end-of-life anxieties? Again, if we were in the room together, I'd ask and you would offer up fears and anxieties that you have heard patients offer to you over the years. Sometimes they have to do with, I'm scared about the future. I'm scared about what happens after death. I find those kind of spiritual questions to be relatively rare, certainly not unheard of, but not uppermost in the minds of most of the dying people with whom I've worked. Rather, the kinds of things that seem to be most present for fear are have to do with how will my family fare after I've died? How am I going to make, or how are they going to be financially after my death? Did I provide adequate resources? Those kinds of things. So often they're very basic sorts of things like that. Sometimes it's fears about, will the family stay intact? Will my children continue to talk to each other? If I've been the one kind of holding the family together, I know that I'm the linchpin, then there may be some reasonable question about whether the family will survive this particular crisis or not. There may also be, and in fact probably far more concerning for most dying people than what happens after death, is what happens between here and death. The vast majority of dying people that I meet are very, very concerned about pain and other symptoms that are part of the dying process. And one of the great gifts I think that hospice offers is the promise that pain and other symptoms can be relieved. And Ira Byock is fond of saying that there is no symptom beyond our control, and that has been true. Refractory symptoms, as we call them in medicine, or symptoms that simply are not, do not give themselves up to our pain measures and things like that. It usually has not as much to do with us not having the ability to control pain as it has to do with non-compliance on the part of family who will not administer adequate medication, or who frequently will say things like, well, I don't want mom sedated, I want her to be alert. And what we sometimes give up in that alertness is a great deal more pain or other symptoms. So nonetheless, folks have lots of anxieties. I find that there are some ways to kind of help address those. One of the things I find, though, is having a basic method for approaching that. One step in that, as it were, is to label what the fear is. It's the reason I ask patients flat out, of all the things that frighten you about what is ahead, what do you suppose scares you the most? There is great power in naming it. And sometimes I have needed to help patients find the words, but rarely. Usually patients are very well able to label. What I frequently find, however, is that at the second step is where families go off the rails with patients. So suppose my patient says, the thing I most fear is whether I've provided adequate financial resources for my wife to survive after me. It's exactly the question, the fear that my own father raised with a couple of family members several months before his death. I wonder if I've taken adequate care. Now, what I learned after his death, he was told by those family members, was, Dad, you don't need to worry about that. We'll make sure mom's taken care of. We'll make sure that she has adequate resources. Unfortunately, that did not, to my way of thinking, did not address his fear. His fear was real. Now, was it a founded fear? Not really. In fact, there was actually a tiny bit of estate left that my brothers and I shared after all of my mom's care expenses were paid, after we paid for everybody coming from out of town to attend the funeral, the grandchildren, paid for lodging, after we paid all of those expenses out of what was left. That's how my brothers and I decided to use the estate. There was still a few $1,000s that the four of us shared between us. Everything was paid. Mom did not outlive the estate that my father left. But what would have probably been helpful for him 23 years before she died was for someone to have sat down with him and said, well, I don't know, let's look and let's think about let's talk about what you have provided. Let's talk about what's there. Let's talk about what your vision has been. Let's talk about that. That 20 or 30-minute conversation would most likely have been much more meaningful to my dad. And so what I think we want to do, and we will have to be the ones who do this because adult children rarely can, and that is we will have to bite our lip and say, tell me about that fear. I am here for you. Let's talk it. Let's talk it through. Let's talk through what the concerns are. Let's talk about the nuts and bolts of that, where it's coming from, not just from an emotional standpoint, but from some very practical kinds of things. And I think social work is a wonderful discipline to do those very things. That's the support aspect of this, is not trying to talk the dying person out of being scared and then to problem solve it. What do we need to do in order to make this an issue that can be dealt with? So do we need to get a financial planner in? Do we need to sit down with nuts and bolts and talk about kind of what's going to happen? What exactly will be meaningful to you as the dying person in order to feel like this fear is ameliorated? So resolving end-of-life anxieties, I believe, is not to pretend fear does not exist, and is not to rationally try to talk people out of fear as much as it is to come alongside them in those fears, to help them articulate what the fears are, and then to creatively help them problem solve what to do about them. Florence Nightingale, the mother of nursing, said it this way: apprehension, uncertainty, waiting, expectation, fear of surprise do a patient more harm than any exertion. Well, every one of us, I bet, has a bucket list. Debbie and I certainly have some things that we want to do. We've decided that we want to do an Alaska cruise sometime while we're still able to get around. And, the nice thing about living in the world of academia is that I have big chunks of time that some people would call vacation, and I can use them to write. And in some cases, I can use them to vacation. And so probably not next summer, but maybe the summer after that, we're going to do one of those inland passage cruises. We all have unfinished tasks, things we want to get done. I recall a patient ask our CNA asked her what she was up to, and she was in the process of recording her life story on a cassette tape. So it tells you how long ago that was, to give to her grandchildren. And the CNA was there one day, and the batteries had gone out in her recorder. She didn't want to tell her daughter what she was doing for fear her daughter would tell her, Mom, you don't need to do that, or that's just going to depress you, or something else. And so the CNA said, that's easy, ran down to CVS, got her some new batteries, and put them in. I believe the patient lived exactly 1 week after she finished that recording. My point is that often we are able to articulate the things we want to get finished, and frequently patients will pinpoint the time of their death by what those tasks are that yet remain, and they'll tell us what they are. They may be seeing somebody, renewing a relationship or reconciling a relationship. It may be seeing a grandchild born or getting to a granddaughter's wedding or something of that nature. But often there are tasks, and what I've found is that if we know what they are, we can frequently come come alongside patients to help them get done. And then finally, I think we are about the business of establishing legacy with our patients. I think everybody wants to believe that their life has counted for something. Because I am a student of funerals, funeral rituals, and funeral customs, you probably know I've spent a fair amount of time in graveyards. In fact, my children hated going on vacation with me, in part because they knew no matter where in the world we were, Dad wanted to stop at the cemeteries that we came upon. And while I tried to be circumspect about that, being in a new place just invited looking at how burial customs were different there from what we'd seen in other places. Well, one of the things I've noticed is that as the hundreds, probably thousands of tombstone epitaphs that I've read, not one of them has a dollar sign with a person's net worth. I've never seen one that explained that he or she drove the latest model luxury car or the size of the house that he or she lived in. I've rarely even seen the name of a business placed on it. Instead, these legacies tend to describe character qualities. He was a beloved father. She was a gracious grandmother. He was a person who loved life. She was an individual who cared more about others than she did herself. That's the kind of legacy we're talking about. And one of the ways I find very helpful for families and for patients when they're still living is to simply ask, who would you say is the person or the people who have most touched your life? And I think it's powerful for you and me to ask that of ourselves. Who are the people whose lives have deeply touched and impacted our own? Bill Worden would be one of those people for me. Dr. Worden, now long since retired from his teaching post and clinical post at Harvard University, was my supervisor in bereavement counseling. He is the one from whom I loved this discipline first. He is the one who imparted so much truth to me. He and I had coffee together when I was in Southern California just last week. Where he and his wife have long since retired now. And one of the things that I enjoy anytime I am with him is relishing in the stories of having practiced in the 1950s and 1960s when I was just a wee boy myself, and to hear him talk about the patients he met and the things he did. To learn from him constantly has been a real love of my life. But the next question is, who have I passed that on to? And fortunately now I'm able to look back on a career that spans more than 3 decades and see dozens, probably hundreds of students and colleagues that I've had some impact on in one way or another. It's one of the reasons I tell people, don't plan any celebration of my life when I'm dead. I hope that I will be missed enough that people will be crying. In fact, I hope you'll be crying great buckets at my death, because you realize that while my life is cherished and I've had a great impact, that I am also missed. I think that it pays for us to ask ourselves the question, who have I touched? And the way I ask that of patients is, who's most impacted you? Who have you passed that on to? Who have you given that concern, that love, that character quality, that quality of gratitude, that quality of generosity? Who have you passed that on to? And in what way do you think the world is a better place because you've been in it? And I think if we will stay in the conversation with dying people, though they heard the message early on, don't speak too haughtily about yourself, they will tell us the ways that they think the world has been made a brighter place because of their life in it. And I think when we do that, what we've done is we've come alongside patients to help them with this very important task of the dying process, which is to come to terms with what my legacy has been. So the last thing I want to say is the thing I have learned over my years of teaching is that if I want something to become mine, the best way to do that is to make it my own by teaching someone else. I provided in the outline that I gave to you that's on the website, 2 cases. What I'd like to encourage you to do in the next few days is to take one or both of those cases, share the principles that we've been talking about today with your team, and work through these cases, thinking about them through the lenses that we've been talking about. If you don't have a team, that's fine. Just do it for yourself and think about the 2 cases that are listed in the workbook that you got. And at this point, I am ready to take any kinds of questions or concerns that may have come up.
Okay. And a reminder for people accepting CEs, when you've been on the line for 60 minutes, you must be on for 60 minutes. You can exit the webinar, but we'd like to encourage you to stay and ask questions. A question is being asked, is there any special advice that you would give to those of us who are working with Alzheimer families, and where they're encountering the long goodbye, and of course their grieving is endless? And so is there any special tips that you could give us?
I sure do. So first of all, honor the person's life as still a life. So in other words, I don't find, in fact, I try to cut this off at the knees. I try to stop the conversation going in the direction of, this is not my mother. Oh, yes, it is. It is your mother. She may act differently than she used to. She may process differently, but she is still your mother. So I try to say that before the family member says that to me. I'll say, a lot of people say, this is not my mom, but actually it is your mom. She acts differently, but she's still in there. And in fact, she probably remembers stuff that happened 50 years ago, at least up till she's not terribly communicative. Tell the stories, tell the old stories. Say, Mom, you probably remember this better than I do. You remember back in 1963, you and Mom and Dad and I, we did thus and so. Tell those stories, even if she doesn't respond particularly. It can be very, very powerful to tell the story. And it's good for me, whether it's good for her or not.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Hoy. And then there's a question, I guess it maps back to the core process of beliefs.
Okay.
And questioning someone about their belief system. If they say, I have no belief system, what would be a way to sort of redirect them? The conversation, I guess, is the question, or what should be done?
Well, I'm pretty cheeky because I've been doing this so long. If somebody told me that, I would probably respond by saying, really? In just about that tone. That's absolute, utter nonsense that a person does. We all have a belief system. And so I think what I would do in that case is I would say, okay, maybe I didn't, I bet I wasn't very clear there. I don't mean, is there a religion that you follow? I mean, what are the things that kind of keep you in the world? I mean, surely you believe something. You believe the sun's going to come up tomorrow morning, don't you? I mean, we all have intrinsic beliefs. They may just need some help knowing what it is I'm talking about. I suspect a person that responds with that particular response, they think I'm looking for a religious answer. I'm not looking for a religious answer at all. I just assume them not have one, in fact.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Hoy. Someone is asking a sensory question. Is it true that the hearing is the last to go in the dying process?
The problem is we've never had a dying person come back and tell us that. We assume that is so. We tell we tell caregivers, don't you dare say something in the presence of a patient that you don't want him to hear, whether comatose or not. But the honest truth is we don't know that. There isn't any way we could really know in any empirical sense. There almost certainly is some sensory response to touch. In fact, touch is much more of a mammalian sense than hearing is. So it probably is that we have we receive tactile stimulation even though we can't respond to it. Maybe more, again, because of the way the neurological system works, I would be inclined to think that feeling is the last sense to go rather than hearing, but we don't know. I mean, that the question often comes about by, is it okay for me to keep telling my mom the stories, keep telling her I love you, telling her, it's okay for you to go? And the answer to that is absolutely, that's okay. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I think that's okay whether hearing is the last sense to go or not.
Absolutely, because it's a comfort to the family members.
There you
correct?
go. That's right. A lot of this we do for us as much as we do for the patient.
Okay. Someone is asking, what was the fourth core process again?
Yeah, sure. So it's belief, fear, task, and legacy is the fourth one. How do we establish life's legacy?
Okay, good. Thank you. How does the dying person usually relate, or why? Why does the dying person say that they see family that is deceased? Caregivers usually say that the patient was hallucinating.
Yeah, I don't. So it could be hallucination for sure. There, as the neurological system is dying, the neurons in the brain, the chemical changes that are going on in the brain through the neurotransmission system are such that the brain imagines all kinds of things in the same way that we imagine things in our dreams that are not real, or that are maybe just latent fears or anxieties that then we work out in our dreaming. So that's probably some of the same neurological processes involved. But it may also be that it's just a flat out spiritual fact that people see, encounter. I may be a biological clinician and a scientist, but I do not depreciate the value of the spiritual. It very much is something that I think folks see and do and hear, and they have experiences of seeing people, and whether it's imagined or it's real, in my estimation, it is rarely not comforting. It almost always is an encouragement. And the last thing I'm interested in doing is medicating it away. Haldol doesn't do a real good job of medicating it away anyway. And so I'm inclined just to say, well, what I don't try to do is talk patients out of it. Oh, no, Mom, he's not there. Mom, you're imagining. No, absolutely not. Instead, I would go with it. Say, well, Mom, I'm not sure that I see all the things you see. Would you tell me what Uncle George is saying? Tell me what he looks like. Tell me what it looks like over there. You have a better view of that than I do. Would you teach me? Is kind of what we're saying. And again, I think what we always want to do is approach patients with respect, not egging them on, not teasing them ever under any circumstances, but rather saying simply, I am the learner, you are the teacher. Just because I can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And if I would accept that reality, that's what I teach my physician students, is always to see the patient as my teacher. If I see the patient as my teacher, I will rarely go wrong.
Oh, wise words indeed. I think we have time for one more question. How can a family member be comforting when they've been told that that a patient has only 3 months to live due to cancer? So I don't know whether this is coming from a professional point of view, how we can be comforting to family members, or I'm not sure. It just says, how can a family member be comforting when they're told, or comforted when they're told the patient has 3 months to live? And then
I think Kim, what I think we all need is the presence of people around us. Even if we say we want to be alone, most of us don't really want to be alone. We want to know we're cared for. We want to know we want to know that people are looking out for us, that we are in their thoughts or in their prayers, if that's a spiritually appropriate term for them. I think we want to know that we are cared for. I think we want to know that that somebody has our back, and that we will not just forget them or not ask. And I think that's one of the most important things that friends can do, is to keep on asking. I know this is a difficult time. I had a great conversation with a friend of mine, actually, whose wife is dying, just the other day, and we sat for a long time and talked. And one of the things at the end of the conversation he told me was, Bill, thank you. He said, I knew I could count on you to talk honestly about this with me. And he said, not everybody around me wants to talk about the fact that she's dying. A lot of people, they say, well, no, you got to keep your chin up. You got to hope for. There is no hope in this particular disease apart from some kind of divine miracle. And I'm a person of spiritual faith, and I have seen very few things in my career that I would attribute to some kind of a divine intervention, kind of healing miracle. Very few, as in 2 or 3 in 35 years. And what I'm gonna say is that in all probability, this man's wife is going to be dead by Christmas. And what I can absolutely say is that everybody around him pretending otherwise is not going to change the outcome one bit. And he feels very alone because good friends will just not go with him there. So I think that's absolutely essential for friends and professionals to do, is to acknowledge if they're wanting. My question is, what's ahead for you? And dying people usually say, oh, I'm dying, and I'm probably dying sooner than anybody around me wants to admit.
Right. Okay. Dr. Hoy, we have another question, but before we take that question, I do need to let everyone online know just how much we appreciate our speaker, Dr. Bill Hoy, today. I know personally it was so meaningful, and the fact that you use your own personal self-disclosure, your own personal experiences to make your points is something that I know all of us really appreciate so much. So we're grateful for your time and your expertise. I want to remind attendees that once they leave the webinar, they'll get a screen that has their evaluation. If you want to go ahead and fill that out online and just have it all done, that's good. Otherwise, you're going to get an email, and then you're going to need to return that eval within 4 days for your CE credit. Now, next month, I want to make it clear that we will be having a family webinar that's sort of slanted toward our family members that are caring for a senior. And so that doesn't mean that professionals are excluded. We'd like to invite you to participate as well. However, there will not be any CEs given for next month. The topic is preparing for the holidays. I'll be your speaker, and we'll just talk about specifically how holidays can be difficult for folks with dementia and for their caregivers. And we'll talk about some strategies and tips to make the holidays a little bit calmer and more peaceful for all of you. So please do join us for that. That is on Tuesday, December 4th at 11:30 a.m. And if you want to know any more about upcoming webinars or other educational opportunities, always be sure to visit our website at www.alzoc.org. And so thank you. Dr. Hoy, I had to get that part out before we return
No problem.
to our questions. Let's see. What's the next one? What's a good approach when the dying person has fear of the unknown after death? So in other words, they don't know where they're going, in other words. So how do we help with that?
Well, so again, my stock and trade, and this is where my background as a psychotherapist becomes so evident, I realize, is to ask questions. So my question becomes, tell me more about that. What do you suppose are the parts that frighten the most? What do you imagine that's going to be like? What do you, what part of an afterlife is scary to you? When I can, I point this individual back to his or her own faith structure. So if, in other words, this person articulates, I'm a lapsed Roman Catholic, then I'm going to inquire about, do you think it would be helpful for you to reconnect with the church? Can I get a priest out here to have a conversation with you? That's one particular community of faith that has a wonderful, I'm trying to come up with a name, I believe it's called the Sacrament of Reconciliation, in which folks can kind of come back around to their faith, and it's not judgmental. It's a wonderful incorporative kind of thing. So that might be what's appropriate, is to have somebody there. I would certainly, if you're not the healthcare chaplain, I would lean on that individual. In general principles, healthcare chaplains are highly skilled and well educated. They understand the nuances of belief in ways that most other healthcare professionals don't. When I was a hospice chaplain, I used to tease the medical director, I don't decide on the appropriateness of OxyContin. You are not qualified to decide on the appropriateness of one or another spiritual intervention with this patient. And I think it's very, very important that we rely on people who have expertise in particular areas to make decisions related to those areas and to intervene accordingly. Moreover, I think part of this has to do with our own anxiety about that, and what if I get a question, and frankly, in all of my years of doing this, I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of patients who have had grave concerns about what was ahead. So I think what I'm really after here is that asking questions to clarify what the concerns are and referring as appropriately to other resources are typically the most important thing, and to continue to stay in the quest with the patient to kind of hear what his or her concerns are. And well, tell me more about that. Well, tell me more about that. Well, what would happen if that happened? Well, what's the worst thing that could take place if that happened? Or, what's the worst possible scenario? And what's the best possible scenario? And when your own parent died, or when this person died, or that person died, how did you make sense of that then? And I think, again, my quest has never been particularly to provide lots of answers. When folks have asked, well, what do you think? I've always been happy to tell them, but I'm much more interested in talking about their perspective and their how they're making sense of it first. And that's usually what I will tell a patient is, I'd be glad to tell you what I think, but let's keep the focus on you for just a few minutes, could we? What do you think goes on, and what do you think happens? What do you make sense of that? What were you taught as a child, and what part of that seems right for you, and what part of that seems really kind of kooky to you now? I think that's a much healthier way to approach.
Thank you, Dr. Hoy. And that was our final question. And so once again, on behalf of this sponsors, O'Connor Mortuary, Alzheimer's Orange County, and Care Choices Hospice and Palliative Services, we thank you for joining us for this very insightful session. And we thank our speaker, Dr. Bill Hoy, for sharing his expertise. Thank you and have a good day, and we hope to see you next month.
Thank you.